Hello, it's Tony Rayns here to talk about Mizoguchi Kenji's last film for the Daiei Film Company, made in 1956, Akasen Chitai, which literally means Red Line District. There's an implied reference to the Blue Line District, which is where unlicensed prostitution, illegal prostitution, takes place in Japanese cities. The Red Line District was where licensed or legal prostitution took place. The film was known in English from the time of its first release in both Britain and the United States as Street of Shame. A somewhat lurid title, but shame, as you'll see, is something of a motif in this movie. Now, these images of Tokyo in 1956 behind the credits are in fact the only documentary images of the city in the whole film, which was otherwise completely shot in the studio. I mean, apart from some trips to the countryside, which we'll come to a bit later on. But the main locations of Yoshiwara are studio built in this movie. This is, of course, about 10 years after the end of the war, when Tokyo was pretty much bombed flat by the Allies in the closing year of the war. So you can see the amount of rebuilding that has taken place since then. The pan ends on the Asakusa Kannon, this huge temple, which is in the northwest sector of the city and is the center of the old Shitamachi or low city area of Tokyo. It's also the final location of Yoshiwara, which was the licensed pleasure district. Licensed prostitution, as we've noted, was outlawed 2 years after this, and it's arguable that the film itself had some bearing on the law that came into force in 1958 to put all this to an end. Now, in the studio's Yoshiwara, we are approaching the main setting of the film, which is one brothel, which rejoices in the name Yume no Sato, which literally means the place of dreams, or dreamland, I guess would be a snappier translation. And in giving us this one establishing view of its entrance, the film is on the left showing us the sign that affiliates this establishment with the local association of coffee and tea houses, a euphemism for brothels, and you notice above the door in English the sign off limits, which reminds us that until a couple of years ago Japan was occupied by MacArthur's forces, and there are at this time in 1956 still plenty of American troops stationed in Japan, albeit mostly confined to their bases, but they're not supposed to go to places like this. Now, the neighborhood patrolman is visiting Yume no Sato and chatting with its proprietress, its madame, whose name is Tatsuko. She's not the owner, her husband is the owner, and we'll see him shortly. And this patrolman serves as a kind of audience surrogate. This is the classic piece of storytelling. His visit provides the pretext for showing us the space that much of the action is going to unfold in, and also to introduce us to many of the characters. So this cut, which we just had, introduces, for example, two of the working women of the house in the background who were previously not seen. So exponentially, as he tells the story, Mizoguchi is also gradually revealing the space and the characters, all of which are good, solid exposition strategies. The young man who runs in is a delinquent, rather well known to the patrolman, but now pretending to have gone straight. We don't discover at this point what urgent message he has for the Madame, Tatsuko, but in fact it's deliberately kept out of our hearing. However, it provides the first of a long series of little plot points that feed into later plot points in the film. And I think what I'd like to draw attention to at this moment is the extreme skill with which the film is rather seamlessly weaving together a number of strands of plot. There are essentially 5 women working in this establishment, plus the married couple who run it, plus various regular visitors, plus towards the end of the film a 6th young woman who comes to join the team. And the film weaves together each of their backstories into a pretty much seamless present-day whole. And I think that this is something that it's a structure that we haven't seen in any previous Mizoguchi film. And the film, therefore, is defying the stereotype of the late film. When people look at, for example, Dreyer's last film, Gertrude, or Bresson's last film, L'Argent, there's a great tendency to find in them some kind of summation, some kind of new serenity, some kind of summing up of the life's work, which is very often, I think, read in, but nonetheless, those films sometimes do have that kind of stereotypical quality. Mizoguchi's last film, absolutely doesn't have it. This film is full of innovations. It's full of things he has never done before, and which in some cases have not really been done before in Japanese cinema. And Mayuzumi Toshiro's electronic score, it's not continuously electronic, but as we'll see a bit later on, it uses electronica in a very avant-garde, innovative way, is somehow signaling the fact that what's going on in this movie is intended to be startling and in certain respects innovative. Now, I don't think that much of the action in the film requires explication or direct commentary. So I'm not proposing to sit here to repeat what you can already see for yourselves perfectly clearly on the screen. But I am going to try and draw attention to some of the film's social context, some of the film's historical context, and some of the film's aesthetic context, and to somehow relate it to Mizoguchi's career. As I've said, it's in many respects an innovative film, quite unlike his earlier films, but in other respects it does hark back to things he's dealt with before, and it does have a theme that is very close to his heart and in fact dominated his career almost from the very beginning in the 1920s. This, in other words, is not the first time that Mizoguchi dealt with the issue of prostitution. Well, let's get some of the history out of the way first. Yoshiwara, the district Yoshiwara, the licensed pleasure quarters, was originally founded somewhere near Nihonbashi in 1617, and it was moved to this area near Asakusa in 1657, so 40 years later. And it came under increasingly strict government control, largely because the geisha in the district kept straying beyond the bounds of their aesthetic profession into the area of prostitution, thereby challenging the actual prostitutes who were active there. And in order to keep some job demarcation lines in place, a politician who was also, it happened, the owner of one of the major establishments of the district, took matters in hand and brought things under pretty tight control. Yoshiwara ceased to exist as a licensed pleasure quarter in 1958, as we've already noted, and the area that it used to occupy corresponds pretty much exactly with a district called Senzoku, Yonchome, fourth district of Senzoku, fourth ward of Senzoku, which is a pretty depressed and a fairly squalid area, to be frank. It's part of one of the most underdeveloped and undynamic areas of the whole of Tokyo these days. If you go there looking for traces of this, you will find very, very little. There's hardly any sign that this used to be the center of a bustling nightlife with a lot of establishments like Yume no Sato. Now, this scene with the very go-getting prostitute Yasumi, played by Wakao Ayako, and her regular John, her client, of course introduces something of the modus operandi of these women working in the house. But it also sets up, like many other details at this early stage of the film, information that is going to be germane to the resolution, the complication, and eventually the resolution of the various strands of plot that run through it. All of which, as we've noted, are very skillfully dovetailed, just like the shot in the hallway a few moments ago, when we saw action in the foreground with Mr. Taya, the owner of the place, action in the middle ground with his wife, and action in the distance where the delinquent boy is scampering about and flirting with passing women. The seamlessness of that, the lack of showing off in it makes it. This is aesthetic daring of a kind very different from what you might find in a film like Citizen Kane, for example, where the showing off is very much part of Wells' agenda. This is very seamless and very unassertive in a way. I mean, I guess you could see it as the mastery of the late period of a great filmmaker. Anyway, Miss Yasumi stringing along her client, although that she does have, as we'll see here, a little momentary interruption, which also is germane to do with loaning money. Provides a moment to just speak about Miss Wakao, the actress. She was 23 when she made this film, and she'd already worked for Mizoguchi playing the younger geisha Eiko in Gion Festival Music a couple of years earlier. And she went on, she was a Daiei contract actress, and she went on to star in countless other Daiei movies, including about 24 for Masumura Yasuzo, who was a junior assistant director on this very film. In fact, nearly everybody in this movie is under full-time contract to Daiei Film Company. Not only the technicians, but also nearly all the cast. There were a couple of names of minor players in the opening credits where Toho is thanked for loaning them. But I think we can assume that pretty much everybody else is under contract at the studio. Now, the following scene continues the exposition. It introduces another of the women who works in the house, Hanae, who has arrived a bit late because she's the only one who doesn't actually live there. She has a husband and child, and so she lives outside with them and habitually arrives late for work. But more importantly, the scene introduces the film's major star, Miki, which turns out to be an anglicization of Michiko. Here she is standing in the half shell thinking that she's Venus, which indicates something about her education and something about her background. I think, a young Japanese woman of the pre-war years would barely be aware of the classical Italian paintings that inspired such a pose. Miki has had a very checkered history, as we're about to find out. She's from a good family. She's from Kobe, and has had an affair with a black GI who jilted her, presumably went back to the States. This happened rather a lot. And she, on the rebound, she has turned to prostitution. It turns out also that she hates her family, particularly hates her father, and in some ways this work that she's doing, which expresses a certain contempt for her clients, is a way of getting at her father. This, of course, becomes much more explicit towards the closing scenes of the film. Let's just have a quick word about Kiyo Machiko herself. She was actually 32 at the time she made this film, so she's in pretty good shape for a 32-year-old, I think we'll all agree. She's originally from Osaka, which means she had no problem with the Kansai Ben, the Kansai accent that she requires to have in the film as somebody from Kobe. She started out as a dancer, and she was in fact discovered by the Daiei company dancing at the Tokyo Nippon Gekijo. And she began acting in 1949 and shot to prominence less than a year later because she played the only significant woman, in fact, in a film by Kurosawa Akira called Rashomon, which made her rather famous. And in point of fact, she starred in quite a number of the films that attracted Western attention to Japanese cinema in the 1950s. She's also the female lead in Kinugasa's film Gate of Hell, Jigokumon. She's, of course, the Phantom Princess in Mizoguchi's Ugetsu Monogatari. She also played Yoki-hi, Yang Guifei, for Mizoguchi in his rather ill-fated Chinese-Japanese co-production. And she went on to star in such films as Ichikawa Kon's The Key, Kagi, also known, I think, as Odd Obsession, and, of course, dozens more. She remained very, very active right through to the 1970s. Now, there's already been quite a lot about money in this house, and this little wrap-up with Miki and the payoff to Eiko, the boy who brought her there, the little gold mine that he's brought to the Yumino Sato, brings us to the larger question of the, not the ethics of prostitution, but the financial motivations for prostitution, which in turn lead us into this upcoming scene, which involves another of the women and her backstory. In this particular case, the backstory is her son, who she believes to be stuck in the countryside with his grandparents, but who, unbeknownst to her, has moved to Tokyo and taken a job, and is now looking up his mother for the first time. It later transpires that the reason he's come to Tokyo is partly economic, but partly also because he's gotten fed up with local gossip in the country village about what his mother is doing to earn the money to raise him. So there in a nutshell is the ambivalence. He feels shame, she suffers an economic imperative because she has to raise him, her husband is dead, and the only avenue open to her is to prostitute herself. I think that ambivalence pretty precisely mirrors the ambivalence that Mizoguchi himself felt towards prostitution. He was very conscious that women often have to sacrifice themselves for the sake of menfolk in their immediate family. And the reason he was conscious of it was because his own elder sister became the mistress of a viscount when he was a teenager, and one of her prime motivations was to raise the money for the Mizoguchi family to enable young Kenji to be sent to art college. He would probably have had to gone straight into trade otherwise, and so he was very aware that his sister had, in a sense, sacrificed her own life for his sake as well as the sake of other members of the family. That aside, Mizoguchi was also a lifelong consumer of prostitutes, and although he was married, his wife, in fact, eventually became insane, but I think not because of his habitual use of prostitutes. He was, like most Japanese men of his generation, he was accustomed to the idea that you could go to the licensed quarters and enjoy yourself, and that was part of an enjoyable evening out and a normal thing for a heterosexual male to do. So for him there was no great moral question involved. However, there was a sensitivity on his part to the feelings of the women who were caught up in the trade, and an awareness, of course, that many of them would not be there entirely by their choice, but were there because of economic imperatives. And this would have been brought home to him very vividly when he was still a pretty young man in his 20s, because a prostitute whom he was involved with in Osaka in the 1920s stabbed him in the back, slashed his back with a cutthroat razor in 1925 in a public bathhouse, and he carried the marks of this attack right to his death. He subsequently reconciled with the woman, and they in fact set up a ménage together again sometime later, but it made him acutely aware in the most immediate terms of how women trapped in prostitution can become very demanding, very bitchy, and very resentful if they feel that you are somehow turning away from them. Now, the horror that the boy Shuichi feels at seeing his mother throw herself at passing strangers on the street is the harbinger of other visions of rivalries and hardships that exist within this house of prostitution. We're about to see the young upstart Mickey in effect steal a customer from one of the older established women of the house. We're then going to see Hanae, the woman who lives outside, with her tubercular husband and their miserable baby, discussing the thoughts that they had about surviving and about possibly killing themselves. This is an option that she has rejected, but which he, the tubercular one, is still very much wedded to. So we're complicating the different threads of the story as it goes along, and at the same time clarifying the various circumstances through the backstories of the individual women. We're clarifying the kinds of circumstances sociologically that push the women into this situation and make them almost totally dependent on the lives they're leading. I should say perhaps at this point that the script for this film was not written by Mizoguchi's regular screenwriter, Yoda Yoshikata, with whom he'd been working since the 1930s. When the project came up, Yoda felt that he was written out on the subject of prostitution because it was something that Mizoguchi had tackled quite many times before. And so he busied himself instead with what was to be Mizoguchi's next film, the film that was Mizoguchi never got to make, although it was taken over by another director and made in his absence, with no great distinction, it must be said. Another adaptation from the Edo period writer Ihara Saikaku, whose writings had already provided the basis for the life of Oharu for Mizoguchi. Anyhow, Yoda declined to write Akasen Chitai, so the challenge was taken on instead by another old friend of Mizoguchi, somebody he'd known since very early in his life, Narusawa Masashige. Narusawa-san has a number of credits on earlier Mizoguchi films also, although nothing particularly striking in this late period of the career. He based part of the script, I think, on a story by a woman recently published, but this is not a direct adaptation in any sense, and the credits don't allege that it is. Now, I'd like to say something about the time frame of the film. The film is relatively short, less than 90 minutes long, and it feels very tight and compact and densely woven. However, it's pretty clear if we look at it closely that the action of the film covers a period of at least 2 months and possibly longer. And I think the way that Mizoguchi expresses that is almost entirely through the grammar that he uses, the editing grammar. The film begins at New Year, so it's towards the end of the year 1955, at the beginning of 56. A reminder, the film was actually released in March 56, so it was intended to seem very, very topical. Mizoguchi uses a visual mix, a dissolve, to indicate that a certain amount of time has passed. But if a more significant amount of time, perhaps weeks, has passed from one scene to the next, he fades out to black and then fades up again on a new scene. At the same time, as is traditional, he uses the fade out and fade in as a convention to kind of signal the end of a chapter. And although the film has overall a remarkably cohesive flow and feels like an almost uninterrupted stream of action, he uses these rather unemphatic grammatical codes, visual codes, to make it clear that time is indeed passing and that this is not all happening in 1 week or in a short period of time.
とにかく明日パス買うわ。あれ、1200、300円ぐらいだったわね。もういいんだよ。無理しなくたって。だって。
Now, we haven't said anything at all about the music in the film, and I think it's about time that we did. From the very opening moments of the film, the Daiei trademark, we heard these rather strange and possibly disturbing electronic noises confected by a composer much Mizoguchi's junior. He was in his 20s still at the time that he made this score, which, as far as I know, was his first film score. His name is Mayuzumi Toshiro. He was one of the Japanese pioneers of electronic music, as you will have already gathered, I think, from listening to the soundtrack here. But his music combines traditional instrumentation, Western-style instrumentation, Japanese instrumentation, vocalizing, and electronica. And I've tried to do some research into what exactly the electronica was, because some of the music here sounds a little bit like the theremin or possibly some treated musical saw, but the likelihood seems to be that this was some kind of sine wave generator of his own devising. It was probably homemade, the electronics at this point. This is, I remind us, 1956, and so this is very much the early days. He uses the weird electronic noises to signal or to underline perhaps the darker side of prostitution. It's the soul-destroying side of prostitution that comes up repeatedly in the film. That means, of course, that it's not there all the way through. In this score you can also hear cocktail-type jazz, you can hear, in fact, more sentimental music for certain moments. There are a wide range of musics heard here, but the thing that everybody remembers always is the electronic music, because that's the most arresting. And just in case it's not obvious at this remove so many years later, as we look at this film, 50 odd years after it was made, this kind of a score was unprecedented not only in Mizoguchi's work. There's nothing at all like it in his earlier films, but it was actually pretty much unprecedented in Japanese cinema. Mayuzumi had done one score for Mizoguchi before, the film Uwasa no Onna, the woman in the rumour, but it's not like this. This was a consciously innovative thing, and I think it chimed rather precisely with Mizoguchi's own desire to innovate in what turned out to be his final film.
全く正月だっての景気が悪いね。ナンバーワンの休みの売り上げはこんなじゃん。ミッキーなんか借金の方が多いんじゃないか。あの子は稼ぎもいいけど、 使い方も荒いですからね。
Now, back to the prostitution issues. You've noticed already that the film is using radio bulletins as a way of keeping us abreast of what's happening in the Diet, the Japanese parliament. And an anti-prostitution bill is being promulgated for the fourth time. It's three times already it's been voted down or has not been passed, but it keeps bouncing back. And Taya, the boss of Yume no Sato, played incidentally by Shindo Etaro, who is in a lot of these late Mizoguchi films. Of course, he was Sancho in Sancho the Bailiff, played Sancho himself. He's also in Crucified Lovers, Chikamatsu Monogatari. He's, of course, another Daiei contract actor, but Mizoguchi specialized in casting him in generally unsympathetic and authoritarian roles. So in that respect, Taya is a bit different in that I suppose you could think of him as a monster running a brothel, but he doesn't seem at all monstrous. And his arguments, his pep talks to the women whom he employs, and his arguments against the politicians who've let him down, including the Diet member he voted for, who he relied on to attack this bill, who turned out to cave into it. He's actually a rather sympathetic figure in many respects. He's avuncular, paternal, and not at all authoritarian. And he, of course, I mean, although there's no suggestion in the film that he avails himself of the facilities of his own house, which he anyway would be unlikely to do given that his wife is running it, his extremely sympathetic attitude to Miki, who seems to spend far more than she earns throughout. In fact, towards the end of the film, when there's talk of her leaving the place, it emerges that her accumulated debts are in the region of 70,000 yen, which is a pretty large sum by 1956 standards. I mean, it's the equivalent of many months' earnings. So, but he indulges her. He waves away her IOUs, and he's always willing to lend her more because he sees her partly because he sees her as a great asset to the house, but partly also because clearly his middle-aged heart is somehow tickled by having this very attractive and very sassy, not to say brassy, young woman on his staff. Anyhow, in the film, Taya, the boss, becomes the spokesman, the default spokesman for the virtues of prostitution. His argument is that these women need employment. There's nothing else around that will pay them anything like as much as this. That they're being protected from working unlicensed. If they worked unlicensed, they would be pretty much at the mercy of whatever man came along and who could do whatever he liked to them, including possibly mutilate or kill them. In working in a licensed establishment such as Yume no Sato, they are protected. And he goes on at a later point in the film to extend this argument to suggest that they're doing, in fact, some kind of social service by providing prostitution. Now, you may view all of this as hypocritical, and that certainly is a point of view, and in point of fact, that is the view that the Japanese Diet took, because, as we've noted, prostitution was outlawed. The bill was finally passed, the fifth time it came up, which was, perhaps by coincidence, about 2 months after the release of this movie. But Mizoguchi, I think, is asking us to bear in mind at all times that there are arguments pro and con. Now, the erotics of the following sequence, the shot, in fact, through frosted glass of Kiyomachiko, as Miki rising from the bath and showing her butt, inevitably reminiscent for Mizoguchi fans of the similar shot in Yankei Fei, where she does much the same thing. It raises the question of the frankness of the film. The film is very frank about prostitution and about sexuality, although very little sex as such is shown in the film. And it's interesting to place it internationally at the time. I mean, I think French cinema was probably the raunchiest in the world in the 1950s, and Melville had already shot an adaptation of Cocteau's Les Enfants Terribles back in 1949, which showed a brother and a sister sharing a bath. But this kind of stuff was way ahead of most international cinema in the 1950s, and I think you could even say it was somewhat ahead of what Louis Malle did a couple of years later in Les Amants with Jeanne Moreau. Maybe one reason is apart from the obvious Japaneseness of it and the fact that the Japanese, not being burdened with a Christian tradition, are not as moralistic about these issues, is that sequence, the attack on the man in the bath, may have had some kind of autobiographical resonance for Mizoguchi, because, as we've already noted, he was himself attacked in a public bathhouse by a mistress of the time who was a prostitute. That was in 1925, long before this film was made, 30 years in fact. Just in passing, this is the second time, or just now was the second time in the film, the first being right at the beginning, when the girls say disparaging things about their clients in ways that must be audible to the men. And I think that's also part of the film's picture of prostitution. There is a clear implication that the men who are being conned by these women do so knowingly or allow it to happen and are aware of their own stupidity and duplicity and vulnerability and openness to being tricked. And that, I think, is an essential part of the film's portrait of the prostitution nexus. Now, I think it's time to talk a bit about the aesthetics of this film and of Mizoguchi's trajectory in general over the many years that he made films. We really need the wonderful David Bordwell here to help us with this, and he's not available, and I'm not going to sit here counting the length of shots, so I can't tell you anything about the average shot length. But you don't need to be an expert or a shot counter to understand that most of the shots in this film are on the long side. There's no fast cutting in this movie. And this accords pretty clearly with Mizoguchi's reputation as a director who pioneered the sequence shot. This film doesn't have sequence shots in it. There is editing all the time, partly, I think, imposed on him by the constricted space that much of the action is set in, and partly by the many strands of storyline that are required to be interwoven here, all of which militate rather against the sequence shot and pretty much force him, I think, to something a little bit more intricately constructed. However, this is a director who was known for pioneering the sequence shot in his films of the 1930s and 1940s. It's what the Japanese themselves called one cut, one shot, by which they really meant one take, one shot. And Mizoguchi set himself an aesthetic challenge way before Hitchcock did with Rope to express an entire scene without internal editing, if he could. Now, I think it's interesting, since these next couple of scenes, basically in narrative terms, we're now focusing on Yorie, very unhappy because she's had a regular customer, stolen from her by Mickey. Yorie attempts to run away with another of her regular clients, and the girls send her off. I think the only narrative thing that needs any kind of commentary here is Yumeko's retreat to childhood, which turns out to be a harbinger of something later as well, when she sings a song that she learned as a girl in Manchuria, and it reminds us that the Japanese colonized and occupied Manchuria only 20 years earlier. In fact, Mizoguchi went to Manchuria and even shot a film, now probably thankfully lost in Manchuria in the early 1930s. Mizoguchi was not a militarist, but he was very, very much into status, and when the army invited him to put on a uniform and go to Manchuria, he found the invitation too good to turn down. And this was in between making leftish films about social problems in Japan, so a man, you could say, of some contradictions. Anyhow, apart from the Manchuria issue, I think this scene is pretty self-explanatory, so let's use this time to say something about Mizoguchi's overall trajectory in terms of his career and his thinking about aesthetics. He started out in the 20s as a jobbing director, of course, doing all kinds of things that were thrown at him by the studio, but also coming up with ideas of his own. And he was a bit of a magpie. He picked up ideas and motifs both from foreign films, from foreign literature, and from Japanese literature. Some of the films he made were commissioned. They were even government policy films here and there, films that expressed improving morals as the government wished to have them expressed. But they were also experimental things. There was an Arsène Lupin mystery. There was an experimental expressionist film, allegedly influenced by German expressionist movies. That's also lost, so we have no way of knowing for sure just how influenced it was. And there was a rivalry in the 1920s with a man called Murata Minoru, who was one of the pioneers of modern Western-style spoken drama in Japan, and who was seen as, the most intellectually solid figure working in the entire film industry. And he happened to be in the same studio as Mizoguchi, and Mizoguchi, always concerned about status, saw him as a bitter rival. Come the 1930s, though, most of that very eclectic experimentation and drawing on disparate sources ended for Mizoguchi, partly because of a couple of adaptations from the writings of the novelist Izumi Kyoka. He suddenly made a retro turn. He started committing himself much more to a theatrical form called shimpa. A kind of, I guess the nearest Western equivalent would be Victorian tragedy, an older form of theatre than the modern Western-style spoken drama, and very much out of fashion by the early 1930s. But Mizoguchi perversely made a renewed commitment to it. And that was a very conscious aesthetic choice on his part. It led him to certain kinds of subject, it led him to certain kinds of approach, and ultimately I think it must have been connected with both his ideas about performance in everyday life. He became very obsessed with people who performed on stage and then perhaps performed off stage, and the connection there might be between a theatrical performance and a non-theatrical performance, and the notion of performance in everyday life. And his aesthetic, his preference, his development of the long take aesthetic. In fact, the sequence shot aesthetic at its finest form. And there are a number of films from the late 1930s, early 1940s, where we find this kind of aesthetic experimentation in full flood. In the post-war years, he more or less abandons it, or at least uses it much less committedly and in a much more ad hoc way. And that, I think, is also true in this film. In the long shots, the long-held takes that characterize this film, there are vestigial memories of his sequence shots. But this is not a sequence shot film. It is a film that does have edits and makes all kinds of connections between disparate characters, disparate feelings through the edits. My contention, and we'll see it in the second half of the film, which is coming up now, is that across its disparate storylines, the film manages to build a kind of unified emotion. And I think that that's part of this film's achievement. Now, speaking of that, I think that was a very skillful bridge from the end of the preceding scene to this one. Yorie leaving on what is supposed to be a honeymoon trip leads us to Yumiko making a trip back to her parents-in-law, the parents of her late husband. And she believes still at this point in the story that her son, Shuichi, is still living with his grandparents. So she expects to find them there. Now, this first encounter in this little, well, I guess you have to call it a noodle restaurant, but in fact it's also the place where the proprietor lives, clearly, because it's as much a home as a restaurant. Very characteristic of rural Japan in the 1950s, still. I don't think you'd find anything like it now, but in those days, this very kind of homely atmosphere indicated that this couple, the couple living here, were basically opening up their living room as a kind of restaurant for people who just arrived at the station, like Yumiko. This scene provides first an indication of Yumiko's discomfort at coming back to the place that she was born. As she says herself, I hate the countryside, I hate being here. For her, this is redolent of a past that she has thankfully left behind. But also this business of taking off the wig, returning to her something like her real persona for her encounter with her parents-in-law in a moment, is, I think, a kind of symbolic stripping of a veil of artifice which she's clothed herself in. Taking off also some of the trappings of her trade back in Tokyo has the same kind of symbolic inference. But equally, there's something sociological going on here, the psychological dimension aside, particularly in the clash between her and her hostess in this little home restaurant. The rudeness or the seeming rudeness of this woman, or perhaps rudeness is overstating it, but anyway, the extreme frankness of this woman when she says, you can strip off your rouge, but you can't strip off your profession, or words to that effect, seems like an overly frank denunciation of a woman who is, after all, there as a customer. However, I think it serves to express a larger antipathy between these two worlds, and it provides a clearer, perhaps the film's clearest indication so far of the antipathy of ordinary people, especially in rural Japan, to the kind of profession and trade that Yumeko has now embroiled herself in. Now, this scene also brings us back to what I was saying a little earlier about Mizoguchi's fondness for shimpan melodrama, this rather retro style that he had turned to in the 1930s, which was the very antithesis of what he'd been doing in the preceding decade. This scene, the encounter with her parents-in-law, is very shimpa. It's very retro in many ways, and it obviously has very strong roots in melodrama. She comes home, she finds that her father-in-law is sick, probably dying in bed. She inadvertently wakes him, or at least disturbs him, by rushing over to look at the postcard from her son. The whole fact that she discovers only now that her son is already in Tokyo, she knew the son was in Tokyo at some level, because of course he tried to visit her in Yumino Sato. So the strands of melodrama that are present in this are, I think, redolent of the kind of work that Mizoguchi was drawn to in the 1930s. We can see more of it in the following scene, the scene that comes right after this, with Hanae and her ailing tubercular husband. However, this is clearly not melodrama in a retro style. It's not presented in inverted commas as melodrama in the way that someone like Alain Resnais might have done a little more recently than this. This is melodrama treated very sincerely, very frankly, for what it is. It's the melodrama of everyday life. And Mizoguchi has finessed it to a degree, and I think he already started this process in the 1930s, by blurring the line between melodrama, the melodrama of everyday life, and a kind of social realism. He can get away with it a little more plausibly in these settings which are redolent of old Japan, of pre-war Japan, such as this country shack where these old people live and have obviously spent their whole lives, such as the dingy accommodation where Hanae and her husband just about survive with their young infant son. And that kind of retro behavior, retro setting, retro flavor is also present in this phone call that Yumiko makes back in Tokyo to the manager of the factory where she now knows her son to be working. This is the kind of thing that mothers would do in pre-war Japan. It's, of course, rather out of tune with behavior in the 1950s. And Shuichi, the son, finds it doubly embarrassing. He's embarrassed enough that his mother is doing what she's doing. It's even more embarrassing that she insists on calling his boss and rhapsodizing to him about his kindness in looking after her son. And the same kind of applies to this scene with Hanae and her tubercular husband, when she comes home and finds him trying to commit suicide, despite their previous pledge that they would not take that course. This is also very redolent of Shimpa, and it reminds us, I think, in some ways of a pre-war film that, by happy chance, has also been released on the Masters of Cinema label. I'm thinking of Yamanaka's film Humanity in Paper Balloons, made in 1937, which was set in a tenement slum not unlike this place that they're staying themselves. This is substantially one take, with minimal camera movement just to follow the action. And it comprises both the melodrama of the suicide attempt, which seems to have been a bit half-hearted, judging by the ease with which he fell down as soon as she lunged at him, but also a kind of expressionist rage against their poverty, which in turn provokes her, when she picks up the crying baby, to offer a statement of very strongly rhetorical defiance. And this pre-echoes what Yasumi says when she is challenged a little later in the film and screams that she hates poverty, she particularly hates the life she has to lead, but it's her response to the dreaded spectre of poverty. Well, here we have the dreaded spectre of poverty. This is exactly what Yasumi is most afraid of. And her defiance is here matched by Hanai's defiance. You'll notice also that it's underlined by more of the electronica from Mr. Mayuzumi. And as I said, this is not an oral motif associated with madness, as it very often is in Hollywood movies, especially film noir. When you have electronic noises on the soundtrack, it's usually a signifier of something going wrong in the brain. Here it's more something going wrong in the moral schema. As I said, it's an image, or an oral image, for the dark side of prostitution. Here we have the bright side of prostitution. It's payday in Yume no Sato. This time the news comes not from the radio, just for a change, but from the newspapers, which are reporting attacks in the diet on the prostitution business, and the newspapers apparently themselves are joining in these attacks very gleefully. So this is very much an embattled institution still. It's worth remembering that this film was considered very shocking by the Japanese audience in 1956, so shocking that it may have actually had some bearing on legislation. And it's interesting to remember that it's exactly contemporary with a group of juvenile delinquent films, particularly rich kid running wild films, that were being made mostly, initially at least, at the Nikatsu studio, a rival company at this time. This was a genre of films known at the time as Taiyozoku films, literally Sun Tribe films, because they were all about hedonistic young people, and the genre took its name from the novel Seasons of the Sun, which by Ishihara Shintaro, now the mayor of Tokyo, the ultra-right-wing mayor of Tokyo, who popularized this kind of fiction. His brother, Ishihara Yujiro, starred in quite a number of these films and was a Nikatsu contract player at the time. These films had an enormous impact and were pretty much exactly equivalent to the first wave of juvenile delinquent or problem teenager movies that appeared in Western countries in the 1950s and early 1960s. And they had exactly the same kind of seismic impact in Japan, which was not used to rebellious youth of any kind, and certainly was not used to dramatically shifted non-Japanese behavior, such as was clearly influenced by this nasty foreign music that was coming in and by the nasty foreign lifestyles that these kids were somehow imitating. Mizoguchi's film has nothing to do with that, although the Mickey character is in some ways like a parallel to the heroes or heroines of Taiyozoku movies. It turns out that her motivation is entirely different. But nonetheless, the film, I think, has a certain parallel to the Taiyozoku films. A parallel in its impact, a parallel in its determination to record important social changes. Now, the immediate social change that's been chronicled there was the discovery that Mr. Shiomi, the haberdasher, the supplier of quilts and refurbisher of quilts to the brothel, has gone bust and run away. A phenomenon not entirely unrelated to the way that Yasumi has been stringing him along, as we saw right at the beginning of the film and have heard intimations of ever since. Yasumi is now pursuing, we saw her at the end of that scene looking particularly resolute about something, and a certain suspense, I suppose, hangs in the air as to what exactly she's decided. Whatever it is, it's brought her to this family restaurant. And this is actually the one glimpse we have in the film of one of the clients of the brothel in his domestic situation. It's not actually at home, but it is with his family, surrounded by his wife and kids, eating in a family restaurant. And the wife, of course, is immediately suspicious that this conspicuously well-dressed and physically quite appealing young woman has bumped into her husband and acknowledged recognition of him. So she's asking questions. Yasumi, who is an old hand at this game, is of course very expert at covering up, and she gives all the right answers and gets away without creating any trouble. However, what she's pursuing is her milking dry of victim number two, having driven the haberdasher out of business by taking every last cent that he had, I think. She's now moved on to this clerk who never has a name. He's not even listed in the cast list by name, but who we have seen now 2 or 3 times in the movie as being her latest victim and the one who has expressed a desire to come up with the money to buy her freedom and cherishes the dream of marrying her. He is, in terms of Mickey's analysis, precisely one of the kind of fools who falls for a hooker in a brothel. Any man who is stupid enough to do that could be seen as deserving all that he gets. It's interesting that as this final twist of the screw is applied, Mizoguchi breaks with the practice that he's followed for most of the film of showing such conversations in one shot, and cuts. And he cuts for good Hollywood reasons, actually, to privilege particular faces at particular moments. But because this is it's a performance by Yasumi. She's once again pretending to have a sick brother who needs all this money for hospital bills. But also because this is a moral conundrum. The man is being duped, and we need to see him being duped and to see how naive exactly he is. Now, this is a fine example of the kind of what I've spoken of before as the kind of connecting threads that run across the different storylines in this film. Because Mizoguchi has just shown us a family for the first time, I mean a real family, a functional family with all the members there, the mother, the father, and the kids, thought naturally turns to the whole question of marriage. And so what could more naturally follow from that but the breakdown of Yorie's marriage? We've only seen one of these girls seriously trying to get away from her life in Yoshiwara and pursue a marriage. Inevitably enough, exactly as Miki predicted, it has failed, and Yorie has come back and is now a bit too embarrassed to actually go in and ask her old job back. So, naturally enough, it falls to Hanae, who is in the pharmacy buying powdered milk for her hapless infant. It falls to her to be the one who is the intermediary and asks the awkward question of Tatsuko, the madame. Interestingly, Yorie is lurking outside in the darkness of the alleyway, just as Hanae's husband does. So poor Hanae is constantly encountering people outside, lurking in the shadows and bringing them help and succor. She is a very maternal woman in many ways, and very helpful and obviously extremely good-hearted. Of all the women in the house, I think she's probably the one who most closely conforms to a maternal archetype. That includes the madame. And she's always trying to be helpful, not only to her own husband and child, but also to others around her. Makes it all the more heartbreaking, of course, that she's unable to help herself more than she succeeds in doing. Now, we've moved from the pharmacy into this very humble noodle stall next door, and what we have here is with these two people flanking Yorie is like an angel on each shoulder, a good angel on one shoulder and a bad angel on the other shoulder. I think that's a Kazakh myth, if I'm not mistaken, or perhaps it's an Uzbek myth. Yorie in the middle, still paralyzed with guilt and regret, is explaining why the marriage ended. Miki saw it all coming and is not in the least surprised, in fact is scornful and sarcastic. Hanae, who is of course very committed to her marriage, hopeless as it may seem, is shocked and dismayed, and is a sympathetic ear, as ever. This is played out almost diagrammatically in these compositions, and again, as in the scene of Yasumi screwing the last drop of money out of her clerk, there are changes of angle. Mizoguchi stresses one side, then the other side. These are not reverse angles, it's not from different people's points of view. He's just providing different perspectives on this group of three in order to highlight particular faces and to emphasize shifts in the balance of emotional power in what's going on in this conversation. It's a very interesting method, very minimal, very discreet, but very Mizoguchi, I think, and absolutely a token of the point he's reached in his art at this very late stage. Now, all the talk about money and Yorie's rather sad admission that when she tried to get a straight job, she was told the only way she could earn anything like 15,000 yen a month was in a place in Yoshiwara, hence her return. Anyway, all this talk about money leads us very naturally back to Yasumi. So Yasumi, who hitherto has been fairly low profile in the house, she doesn't seem to have been involved in any of the melodramas that the others have, is now emerging as the polar opposite of Mickey, where Mickey runs up debts thoughtlessly and throws away the IOUs. I mean, we just saw her offering to trade her IOUs to the pharmacist for a free service in the brothel. So that pretty much sums up her attitude to spending and keeping money. Yasumi, by contrast, is a compulsive hoarder, and now, for the first time, and rather late in the film compared with the other women, we hear her backstory. We hear why she's there, what motivates her, the need to keep her obviously hated father out of jail and raise bail for him. And it leads her to a statement of defiance, a statement of hatred of poverty specifically, which exactly parallels what we saw from Hanae when she came home and found her husband trying to kill himself. This kind of rhetoric raises the emotional temperature of the film, and it's preparing us for the climactic scenes to come. At the risk of being obvious, while Yasumi is raging against poverty, Mickey, as usual, is asleep in bed, and hard to wake up, in fact, and being summoned to yet another client. Otane's role is, as usual, to call her to work. Now, these next three scenes are really a measure of why this is such a great movie. If it were possible, if there were a scale which allowed us to measure the degree of emotional and physical violence, then the next three scenes, which bring the stories of three of the women to some kind of climax, would be a continuous rising graph. You would see a line just going up and up and up. And all three scenes are quite different. They have no connection in narrative terms. They're private traumas for these three women. However, they combine in the emotional temperature of the film, if we can put it like that, to produce a kind of composite climax, if you like. They feed off each other emotionally in audience terms and make the film as powerful as it is. This, I think, is absolutely the measure of Mizoguchi's mastery at this late stage of his career. And just in case it needs underlining, demonstrates how little enthusiasm he had for some of the other films he made in later years for Daiei. Compare the intensity of these scenes with the emotional flatness of Chikamatsu Monogatari, the stupid historical charade of Yang Kuei-fei, the bombastic rhetoric of Shinheike Monogatari, New Tales of the Taira Clan, which is actually not part of this Masters of Cinema series for rights reasons. And you see that this is Mizoguchi back on the ground that he's long since claimed for himself, and where he feels absolutely confident and absolutely engaged. He's tied up in these contradictions. Now, I haven't talked about what's actually going on in this scene, but it's actually quite interesting, of course. We learn fully the backstory of Mickey. We've had already a sketch of it at the beginning of the film. We now learn in far more detail what the problems are. because this man, of course, is not a client but her father, who has come to drag her back to Kobe and to the bosom of her family. I don't think the scene requires any explanation as such. I mean, the dialogue is pretty explicit, and I think the meanings are very clear indeed. There are a couple of interesting things to note about it, though. One is that the climax of the scene, in which Miki implicitly offers herself to her father, was apparently, according to Yoda, not in Narusawa's script. So that means that it was added by Mizoguchi during the shooting. Mizoguchi, not a director noted for improvising, a director in fact noted for giving his scriptwriters a very, very hard time by demanding endless rewrites and having endless suggestions and being endlessly perfectionist in matters of both the writing and things like the set dressing. But here, according to his longest-term collaborator, Mr. Yoda, he felt free to take the scene further than the scripted version and make it even more shocking. I think it's still shocking even now when a daughter offers herself to her father as a prostitute. I don't think the shock value of the scene has diminished one iota in the last 50-odd years since the film was made. But you can imagine how intensely shocking it would be to a Japanese audience in 1956. Very calculated. And it reminds us that just a few years earlier, when Mizoguchi made a film called Women of the Night, this was in 1948, it was made for the Shochiku company, so it's a different contractual deal. That was a film about unlicensed prostitution in the immediate post-war years, and a film very much about lives on the edge, about people living very, very dangerously and becoming very hysterical and very primitive in many ways. And critics at the time described this and some of the other films that Mizoguchi made in the late 40s as like wild animal films. It was as if the people were no longer human, they were behaving like beasts. They'd lost all their trappings of civilization and civilized behavior towards each other and towards themselves. Well, I don't think Mizoguchi took that as a criticism, because I'm pretty sure that that's what he intended when he made the films. But here's a 1956 version of The Human as a Wild Beast, and it's somewhat more nuanced and refined than it was in the late 40s films, because what we have here is a very clear moral opposition. The reason that Miki rails against her father is because he is the ultimate hypocrite. He is the one who drove her mother to death, in her view, by having mistresses, by womanizing. He's, in fact, although he didn't come to Yume no Sato as a client, he's exactly like a client in Yume no Sato. There's no difference. And so that's why she treats him as she does. That's why she pretends to offer herself to him. That's why she humiliates him and sends him out into the night like one more disappointed John. So this development, incidentally, underlines the difference between someone like Miki and her contemporaries in the Taiyo Zoku films, which we talked about a moment ago. She, unlike them, is not hedonistic. She's driven by a clear sense of moral outrage vis-à-vis her father. She obviously doesn't care very much about the fate of her siblings, her better-mannered siblings. And this final declaration that she's going to stomp off and see a Marilyn Monroe movie throws everything into a really sharp perspective, it seems to me. Now, that scene, the climax really of Miki's story, although not the last time we see her, of course, feeds, as I tried to suggest earlier, directly into this scene, which is another parent-child relationship climax, this time between Yumeko and her son Shuichi. Now, somebody who's definitely not going to see a Marilyn Monroe film is Yumeko, who takes this call thinking it's a client, but then every time that Shuichi, her son, has anything at all to do with Yume no Sato, he's mistaken for a potential client. So this is just the latest in a long series of such misunderstandings. The only difference is that this time it's his mother making the misunderstanding, which of course makes it all the worse. Now, I think this entire scene, or I say scene, but it's actually three little scenes that are linked, which together are up to about 6 minutes, and that makes it one of the longest suites of scenes on a single topic in the entire film. picks up very directly from the confrontation between Mickey and her father. And this is what I was trying to suggest a little earlier about the rising curve of emotion, and especially vis-a-vis both emotional and physical violence across these scenes. This is the middle of three scenes that bring the stories of three of the women to some kind of climax. And this obviously is Yumiko's climax, because at long last she's going to see the son that she went to the countryside looking for. He is in the factory where he works, and he, as we've already you can tell from his very look, from the way he's dressed, from his face, from the way he speaks, is another antithesis of the Taiyo Zoku type. He's not a pampered rich kid living for kicks or for any kind of hedonism. He's a hard worker. He's a country boy who is interested in bettering himself and getting ahead. In fact, he's exactly the son that Yumiko wanted to produce, and it's the reason that she prostituted herself in the first place after the death of her husband precisely was to pay for him to have this kind of an education. The irony is that he, being the type that he is, cannot accept her profession, and that precipitates, as we're about to see, a kind of break between them, which has really disastrous effects on Yumiko's mental health. I think it's quite striking that this is, and apart from Yumiko's trip to the countryside, to her parents-in-law's home, looking for him, this is the only other time in the film that we have an extended location scene. And it's a break from Mizutani Hiroshi's set of Yoshiwara, and specifically the interior of Yume no Sato itself, which is where, after all, a great majority of the film is set. I think the fact that this does take place in the countryside, on location at this factory, gives it a certain kick that it would not have if it were done in the Yoshiwara set, for example. For a start, it opens up the film visually and atmospherically. It lets the film breathe to some extent. For another thing, it roots Shuichi in a context in which he is at home and in which his mother is out of place. And I think that's very important to the emotional dynamics of the scene also. If this were her ground, she would probably be surer of her position. Since it's far from her ground, and despite this rather defiant attempt to make it her ground by sitting down and lighting up a cigarette, it absolutely is not, and she's both visually and tonally out of place here. The fact that this is a confrontation every bit as cataclysmic as Mickey's confrontation with her father just now gives the film a very dark, very despairing view of parent-child relations. As we'll see, it goes on from here to go even further and to dramatize this not in terms of family conflicts, but also in terms of emotional conflicts between supposed equals, between men and women. In other words, it anticipates a lot of modern thinking about the sex war. Now, as this scene pushes towards its climax, and the rising sense of danger is going to escalate into actual physical violence, which didn't quite happen in the scene with Miki and her father. So I think Mizoguchi leads us back into this issue of pretense and performance. Shuichi is not performing. He's a very straightforward boy who is, I think, probably frank at all times. But he is pretending, because he doesn't dare say what he wants to say to his mother at first. So he makes the small talk, he answers her questions, he talks about his ambitions. What he really wants to say is what he's saying now, which is, I disown you, I don't want you to be my mother. Those are the words he didn't have the courage to say before. She, conversely, is still pretending, because she is denying to herself that she has lost her son. I think it was already pretty clear when she took his phone call and initially took him to be a client, a John. But Yumiko has now had that illusion stripped away from her. And as her son runs away, never to be seen again in this film, and she gives chase, I think that her story has reached its apex, and it can only be downhill from now on. And indeed, back in Yumeno Sato, she's virtually catatonic, and it's clear that some kind of turning point in her life has been reached, and there's no way back anymore. Madness was a standby of the Shimpa theatre, and once again, Mizoguchi here, I think, finesses it into a kind of social realism. This is both melodrama and a realistic response to an actual moral conundrum that he has dramatized, I think, very succinctly, but also very plausibly. And it's very interesting. I think that this moment of Yumiko's probably terminal decline is counterpointed further in an extra little twist by the introduction of a new character. Rather strange at this late stage in the film to have a new character introduced, but here she is, and look how young she is. Her name is Sachiko, and just as we learn these other women's backstories one by one, so we get hers right the moment she appears. We learn who she is, where she came from, why she's there, which particular man she's working on behalf of. In this case, it's her father, a coal miner who's had an accident and can't work anymore. Well, her father probably does need a doctor and probably needs doctor's bills paid, but there's somebody closer at hand who also needs a doctor. And her problem, Yumiko's problem, is going to be exposed by the appearance of one of her regular clients, who expects her to be her good old jovial self, and is dismayed to discover that she's anything but. I think it's quite interesting that, especially in relation to what I was saying just now about performance and pretense, that Yumiko, the film's sign of Yumiko's madness is a reassertion of her old identity, initially. The first thing she does is refuse to acknowledge the name Yumiko and revert to her real name, which is Kadawaki Kayo. That's the name she was born with, it's the name that she was married with, it's the name that she was a mother with, so her son is Kadawaki Shuichi. And reasserting it at this point is a way of saying, I'm not your plaything anymore. Obviously, this is the wrong thing to say in a brothel, where you're allegedly one of the star performers. And the irony, I think, that governs this scene is that Yumiko now is as out of place in the brothel as she was out of place in the grounds of the factory in the previous scene. This is a woman who no longer has a place. Her response to that, and the film pushes this further, I guess this was in Narasawa's script, but Mizoguchi undoubtedly demanded it. He pushes the concept further by having her regress in some way to childhood, the last happy moment that she remembers. And we knew in the scene in the party to send Yorie off on her abortive honeymoon trip, that Yumiko's happiest moment was in Manchuria 20 years ago, when she sang the song to prove it. And now she sings the song again, and so she has regressed in some sense to childhood. She's clinging rather desperately to the one happy memory she has to cling to. Well, this is all a bit dime store Freud, I know, and I apologize for that in some way, but the fact is it does draw us back to the realization that the film is rooted in melodrama, in Mizoguchi's passion for Shimpa, and his confidence that you can express things this way, both very immediately and emotionally, involvingly, but also with a degree of expressionist force that perhaps would not be possible in common or garden realism. Now, we're already into the third scene of this suite of three, and as I already suggested, this time the conflict is not between members of one family, but between a woman and her client. The client has been strung along. He's been milked dry, in fact, of his money, just as the haberdasher was earlier in the film by the same woman. Now he thinks he's come to collect. He's offering a honeymoon, very much like the kind of thing that Yorie went off on earlier in the film, and is being told in pretty unceremonious way that she ain't going. So the revelation hits that he has been strung along. Now, I'm describing the scene, when you can see it perfectly well for yourself, simply because this is the climax of these three scenes of emotional and physical violence. And Mizoguchi, I think, has modulated this very expertly, so that there is a crescendo, there is an escalation, it is like a rising curve or graph. And this man, the clerk, the unnamed clerk's discovery that he has ruined his life for this woman who is never going to be his, is in fact unpossessable, that she has been performing, in other words, for him. She's been feigning and faking and telling him lies. His discovery of this is catastrophic for him because he, at this point, reveals that the money that he's just given her was not his to give. So he's also ruined his own life in more ways than one. Not only has he had all his hopes dashed, he's also rendered himself criminal and subject to arrest, prosecution, and undoubtedly long-term imprisonment. She doesn't care, because women don't care about these things, especially hard-boiled women like Yasumi. And in this respect, we noted earlier that she was the opposite in most respects of Miki. In this respect, she's the same as Miki. Although she comes about it on the other side of the circle, she goes round the other way. In other words, they reach the same point eventually, which is that of total disdain, total contempt, and total exploitation of the men who provide the money. And when the performance is over and one of the main players runs off stage, leaving the other one slumped on the floor, there's a moment of emptiness. We're left with an empty stairwell there. Now, the cut from the empty stairwell to the ambulance leaving downstairs implies or suggests pretty strongly that these things are happening at the same time, which means that the women downstairs don't know what's going on upstairs. Although Tatsuko, the madame of the place, does know and complains, how could we be so unlucky to have all these terrible things happen to us on the same night? In a way, that's the scriptwriter's acknowledgement of the melodramatic contrivance involved here, and a rather wry, self-aware gesture, I guess, on the part of the filmmakers. But it's also finessed in a different way because, once again, Mizoguchi and Narusawa have the idea of using a radio bulletin about the progress of the anti-prostitution bill in the Diet to cover over any suggestion of excessive melodrama. So even as a melodramatic strand of the film reaches its climax, so the film very subtly, almost imperceptibly, shifts back into a social realist register by bringing us the latest news from the Diet, the Japanese parliament. This use of the radio news to announce the latest defeat is actually the fourth defeat of this bill in the Japanese parliament. Of course, structurally parallels the first one, the first time we heard news of the bill being reintroduced at the beginning of the film. And correspondingly, Taya's pep talk to his remaining girls exactly matches the first pep talk to the remaining girls, which he gave when he was about to set off to do some lobbying at the Parliament. This time is different, of course. I mean, as always, when you have patterns of cyclical repetition like this, it's necessary to bring changes and to introduce variations. In this particular case, Taya is looking on the bright side that his business has been retrieved and he thinks things can go on as normal. The three girls who are left, or women, let's say, who are left, plus, of course, the newcomer, whose presence becomes an implicit reproach, at least visually, if not morally, to everything that's being said here. The three women left have been so marked by the evening's events, although their lives have not had the kind of violent climaxes that their colleagues have had. They're so marked by a sense of defeat, pain, mortality, that they're in no mood to get upbeat with their boss. And in other words, things have changed. This is quite complex, I think. Mizoguchi, it seems to me, throughout his life is drawn, as we've said earlier, to themes of performance, and very often he tells stories about professional actors who are involved in performance. But he's also very much interested in the sense that people perform in everyday life. People put on performances for each other. They pretend to emotions that they don't sincerely feel, or they pretend to be people who they're not really, in order to communicate to certain things, to establish certain relationships, to create certain balances of power and influence. This has always been a matter of great interest and concern to Mizoguchi. And in this particular film, because he has characters who, by definition, perform. They're not professional actors, but they do come into work and they have to dress up. They put on wigs, they put on makeup. They behave, in other words, exactly like actors. At this moment, although they're still wearing their makeup, rather like Yumeko, when she reverted to her childhood and her real name, they've lost their roles. These are women who have somehow been returned to some more virginal state. So, you could say, has Yasumi, who we discover in the film's coda, has become the new Shiomi, the new haberdasher. Not having driven the original one out of business and forced him to run away from his debts, she's taken over the business, and Taya is one of her first customers. He's even sent flowers to her grand opening, which is a very typically oriental thing to do. It's done in Japan, it's also done in China, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. Yasumi is now what she always wanted to be. She's bled her clients dry of their money in order to set up in business herself, and her abiding phantom of fear of poverty has finally been vanquished. And Yasumi, of course, for old time's sake, is proffering her wares to her old former employers in Yume no Sato. She's also continuing to offer loans to her former colleagues in Yume no Sato. So, in other words, she learned all her lessons from her years of prostitution, and although she hasn't entirely left them behind, and that she's still going to be visiting the brothel, she's not going to be working there, she's just going to be trading there. So she's traded up. This is something that writers on the city pages would, I think, recognize as a syndrome. I believe it's what's considered a natural progression in financial circles. Now, Yasumi's decision to get out of the prostitution business is a very smart one, because it is about to be closed down. The fifth presentation of the anti-prostitution bill to the Diet is the one that finally works. It's passed not long after the film's release, in fact this film's release, and it's finally enacted. It comes into force on March the 31st, 1958, about 2 years later. And so from April Fool's Day 1958, licensed prostitution is no more in Japan. Whether the film had a direct effect on this is a matter for speculation, but it is the fact. Prostitution, needless to say, does still exist in Japan, but it's no longer licensed. There are no more licensed brothels in the country. Yasumi's new beginning is the first of two new beginnings with which the film chooses to end. The other is that of the ingénue Shizuko, whom we've already seen and whose backstory we've already heard. I think what happens to Shizuko is she's made up for her grand debut, which is in fact the loss of her virginity, and what Tatsuko says to her about hating putting her through this, but her mother has been writing frequently and it has to be done. I don't think all of that needs much commentary, really, so maybe this is the moment to say that only a very short time after completing this film, and while still working on the script of Osaka Story, which was to be his next, the Ihara Saikaku adaptation I mentioned earlier, Mizoguchi fell ill with leukemia and was hospitalized. and sadly died in hospital in August of 1956, leaving a script for Osaka Story more or less finished, but nothing shot, and in fact nothing to add to his filmography after this movie. So this really is a swan song. To me, it's very wonderful that his final film, first, is a film he actually wanted to make, since, like most filmmakers working in old-style film industries, he had to make more than his share of films that he didn't actually want to make, but which the companies imposed upon him. And furthermore, that it's a film that contains not only fine aesthetic achievements, what I called earlier, the intricacy of its construction, I think, is really something quite marvellous. And in particular, the way that it's more than the sum of its parts, the different strands of storyline combine into something bigger, which has its own momentum and its own energy and its own rising curves of emotion and falling curves of regret. These are all somehow kept in sync, despite cutting across different storylines, and that seems to me a wonderful achievement. And also a final refinement of his long-take aesthetic, no longer enslaved to the formalism of it, but prepared to spend as much time as it takes looking at things, such as in this shot, the final shot in the film, which is absolutely the male view, the male gaze, if you like. It's a man looking at a woman, but it's a terrified young woman, and her new beginning doesn't promise very well for her future.